listening to Committed to the Word, a ministry of Calvary Chapel La Habra. For more info, please visit us at www.calvarylahabra.org.
Psalm 77. Another psalm of Asaph, set to Jeduthun. The background of this psalm is a familiar one. There's a couple of other psalms, Psalm 74 and a couple of others that have a familiar connection to the same background, and it's that time in history in the nation of Israel when they were led into captivity. Judah, that part of the kingdom, was led into captivity by the Babylonians. And it was a very difficult time. God had outlined how they would follow Him, how they would walk with Him. He had rules, He had regulations, He had ordinances, He had law. And part of that was that they would need to let their land rest, the Sabbath rest, every seventh year. They wouldn't do that. They didn't do that for over 490 some odd years. And so God says, you're doing that. They were getting into idolatry. There were a number of things that led to this, but God had warned them and warned them and warned them. And finally there would come that day where God would say, enough is enough. You owe me some years, and you owe me 70, basically, is what God is going to say. And so God would let them be led away into captivity. Now, as the nation to be led away into captivity, they would take most of them, many of the Jews, and some of them would be left in the city of Jerusalem itself. Jeremiah writes about the remnant, some that didn't get taken off into Babylon, and what that life was like. This particular author, named Asaph, again, one of the worship leaders in the line of Aaron, those that led worship in the temple services, in the temple settings. This particular individual, it's quite likely as we read through the psalm that he might have even been with Jeremiah there in Jerusalem as part of the remnant to minister to those that would have been left behind. What would that look like today if someone laid siege on, we'll just narrow it down to what we can comprehend, but the state of California, and led, 90% of us were led away into a foreign occupation. They came in, they dominate us militarily, they defeat us, and they take away most of us. And they leave our state in ruins. We're already in ruins morally and spiritually, but in every form of military defeat and an overwhelming campaign, and the city would just be lying in ruins. And let's just say that this was the worship center, and even this place would be in ruins. And all of the artifacts that we used for worship would be just taken off and be used in very immoral ways. But there'd be a few of us here. I'll put myself here. There'll be a few of us here. And what would that be like to wonder where your relatives were? What would that be like to wonder where your friends were? And it would take you a few weeks just to sort through who's here, who's not. What's life like now? And we would need to be ministered to, would we not? And so, in that setting, this particular writer finds himself. Most scholars put him right in that setting. And as he is there, he would be asking a similar question that we would be asking, and that would be this: where are you, God? How long, God? Why, God? Picture a couple of your relatives gone. Picture your loved ones and your friends. The warning has come, and the warning has come, and the warning has come. God said where the enemy would come from and where He would lead your people to. The warning has come. The warning has come. And now it's happened. Days go by, weeks go by, and you're saying, Lord, why? Lord, will you intervene? Lord, will you help? I need your help. That's what's going on in this psalm. And then there's a roadmap. It starts there, and then it kind of moves forward from that, where are you, God? Please help me, God. Why, God? To a contemplation of God, a reflection and a remembering about the history of God, what God has done. And at that particular point in time in the psalm, we'll get there, Asaph's heart begins to turn, and he begins to see God in the here and now. Circumstances don't change, but his perspective is going to change. And we see that a lot within the Psalms. And I like to camp out on those Psalms because I can never be reminded enough of this. Okay, can I just be honest enough to say that and open enough to say that? I can never be reminded enough about this. So that's the history. That's the background. So he will move from disappointment and despair to confidence in God. So Psalm 77, I cried out to God with my voice, to God with my voice, and He gave ear to me. In the day of my trouble I sought the Lord. My hand was stretched out in the night without ceasing. Picture this guy. My soul refused to be comforted. I remembered God and was troubled. I complained and my spirit was overwhelmed. And then he sighs. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I have considered the days of old, the years of ancient times. I call to remembrance my song in the night. I meditate within my heart, and my spirit makes diligent search. Will the Lord cast off forever? And will He be favorable no more? Has His mercy ceased forever? Has His promise failed forevermore? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has He in anger shut up His tender mercies? Selah, he sighs. Oh. We know that something is weighing very heavy on us when it causes us to not be able to sleep. You ever been there? Every waking moment is driven by these unsettling thoughts about the circumstances. We try to shake them from our thoughts, but we can't. We might even, in the middle of that night, as we're wrestling back and forth, just like Asaph is here, we might even doze off just a little bit. But when we doze off, our minds go into that very thing, and we start dreaming about that very thing. I told Lori, we're at that point where Kayla, our oldest daughter, is getting ready to go to college. It's the first time that the Cook family unit is going to, sorry, Sarah, to bring this up. I know you just went through this with Garrett, so weep with Sarah later, please. But it's the first time. We've been together. We've homeschooled these girls. We've been together, and it hit me the other day. I'm like, Gloria, I'm not doing good with this. I love this girl. I really do. She knows that, and she's the daughter that made me a father. I always tell her that. And so I look at her, I see myself in her in so many ways, I see Lori in her in so many ways, and I've got to drive down and drop her off at a college. And so, I've just been I'm processing through all of this. So the other night I couldn't sleep. I'm going back and forth, and I'm like, man, Lord, this isn't a bad thing. This is a good thing. What's wrong with me? Help me out. And I'm just kind of flopping back and forth, back and forth. Finally, I dozed off. And you know what I did when I dreamt? I drove her in my dream all the way down to college, and I dropped her off. I did. I said goodbye to her like 30 times. What a horrible dream. I just want to say goodbye once. But I woke up and Lori's like, what's wrong with you? I'm just troubled by this. And this is a little thing. This is actually a good thing. But I'm just being dad. Dad's doing what dads do when they're letting go of their baby girls. But Asaph here, let's go from some circumstance that's light and necessary to one that's heavy and in his mind and in his heart, absolutely don't need it. And this is just radical. Unable to sleep. He begins to pray there in verses 1 and 2. I like the way he breaks this down. He first prays to God in 1 and 2, then he moves on and he begins to, as he's praying, he begins to remember God, and not in the positive sense, we'll see. He'll get to the remembrance of God in the positive sense in a few verses. But he prays to God, then he remembers God. And then in verses 7 through 9, he begins to question God a bit. But the one thing I see here in Asaph, a worship leader going through crisis, in times of crisis, in times of pain, prayer should be a natural response of a believer. It should be natural. Asaph, verse 1, cried out to God. Cried out to God. There are times when we're praying here before the service, and there's a very quiet posture with someone praying or praising. Sometimes that happens with me. I can barely speak. There's part of that with Asaph as well. There's that time as we're here where someone just cries out to God. Tonight, as we were starting to petition God for this service, someone cried out for salvation. They just cried out. You ever cried out to God? Don't care who's around. You cry out to God. Well, he did this and he did this in this particular setting, at least this particular thing he's referring back to, all night long. He cried out to God. And that was a way of saying it was earnest. He was earnestly seeking God all night. Please God, please God, please God, please God. Please hear me. He sought the Lord in verse 2. He reached out his hands in the darkness of that night. Just reached out his hands and just cried out to God, and he sought God all night. And even says in verse 1 that, he gave ear to me. In other words, as he was crying out to God, he believed in a God that heard him. He believed God does hear when he cried out to him. So that's a little bit of insight. And that's a good place to be. My soul, he says in verse 3, refused to be comforted. You know what that means? That was a long, long, long night. My soul refused to be comforted. He was crying out, he was reaching out, but God, at this particular point in time, in his time of reaching out to God, had not touched him. He says, I remembered God and was troubled. What? Well, what he's saying is, I remembered God, and possibly thinking about times past, possibly thinking about those times when the nation was still together, when they were having worship services, regular worship services, and he was part of those worship services. Maybe the times he led worship in the temple itself, and he led people to worship God. He was in those moments. He led people into the presence of God. And yet now he's finding no comfort for his own heart when this worship leader is in his bed at night. He can't sleep. Flip-flop, flip-flop. My soul has no rest. I'm crying out to you, God. I believe you hear me, but you haven't responded yet. But I remember those times you used to. That's what's going on with Asaph right now. Mead and I often talk about how awesome it is to be on the stage in the presence of God. And that's not that God doesn't work in the back. It's not that I don't know. I'm not in the back very often. I believe God's Spirit is in this room. But there's something about being here and hearing the praise, hearing you guys praise. There's something about being in a corporate setting where God's presence is just moving. And then there are those times when you're like, God, remember me? The other day you were like really, really revealing yourself. And like right now I'm like, are you here? Are you here? Do you guys ever have that happen in our worship services? Be honest with me. It's like, wow, you're here sometimes, God, and then other times you're like, where are you? Where are you? That happens to me sometimes. And I just pray it's never on the last song. That's what I pray. Oh, may it not be on the last song. Right before I'm about to